Yeah, you can go ahead and turn the lights off. That'd be fine. So chapter 11, we're going to deal with some of the congressional powers that exist. So now that we are familiar with how you get elected and who all is involved, excuse me, in Congress, we're going to talk about some of their abilities, powers they have, and excuse me, sorry about that. So we'll run through a lot of things here in kind of a general overview. Feel free to stop me and ask questions if I am being too general or if I'm not fully explaining something. I don't want to make the false assumption that you know what I'm talking about if you're not sure. So stop me and ask a question there if you're not exactly sure what we're talking about. So as we look at the scope of their power and what they're allowed to do, Congress is not unlimited in their power. They are very much limited by the way that the Constitution outlines their powers. So they can't just go doing whatever and however they want to. So there are certain powers that Congress is specifically granted, and they're classified into 3 sections here. First of which is the express powers. And these are going to be the powers that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So as you read through the Constitution earlier this year, you would have read over them. Whether you remember any of them or not, that is not up for a test question right now. But they are in there, and so we'll talk about some of those express powers. The powers that are implied are powers that we can reasonably deduct or we can reasonably read into what the Constitution says. So some of the things that we talk about that are implied, we should be able to easily find those in the Constitution, even though they're not specifically mentioned. We could make those connections very quickly. Juniors, I need you to check your computer bag for a moment real quickly. Luke Wilson is missing his computer bag, and he is not sure if it got switched. Apparently he has some papers in it that have his name on it, so if you're a junior, just check your computer bag really quickly. If you discover that you find it, run down to the office real quickly. The third one here is the inherent powers. Inherent powers are those that are held by all of the states and so there's not a whole lot of inherent powers. Oh, we found it. Good. Very good. Great. All right. So there's not a whole lot of the inherent powers we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk mostly about express and implied. So we're going to look at interpretation. This is review from way back at the beginning of the semester. So somebody who is a strict constructionist view on interpreting the Constitution, how are they going to view the Constitution? Don't say strict. Literally, good. So when they're looking at a law that is being proposed, what is their mindset? Dave? Good. Can it be found expressly in the Constitution? Is it written out? If it's not written in there, then they're probably not going to support it. How about the loose or liberal interpretation of the Constitution? How are they going to view that? Somebody besides David, since he already answered the first part of it. Kenzie? Okay, that is part of it. If you are looking at a bill that is up for debate and you want it to pass, how are you going to look at the Constitution if it's not specifically written out in the Constitution? What is your mindset going to be? Remember my illustration with mom and dad's rules?
Like, if they're liberal, like conservatism, like they're broad, they're gonna go outside the box and do something that's not in the Constitution.
Okay, so they're going to have the mindset of, well, it doesn't forbid me from doing it, so it must be okay. If the Constitution does not outline it and say, well, you're not allowed to do this, so I'm going to make it acceptable, those two different ways that can be interpreted by members of Congress. Now, as we look at some of these express powers, we're going to begin here with commerce. And their powers here come from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and it lists out many of these express powers. Congress has the power to tax. Are we thankful for our tax power? Sort of. It's kind of a bittersweet love-hate relationship with tax, right? We don't like paying it, but we love receiving it. That tax return's nice, yes. How else do we see the benefits of our tax money? What? Okay, those of you that are applying for financial aid for college, absolutely. How else do you see benefits of your tax money? Streets, what else? Roads, yeah. Yeah, all that construction you've been seeing on 65 recently. Yeah, we're anxious for that to be done. But once it's done, be nice. At least we hope it will be. So they have the power to tax. So it's important for us to understand the purpose of the tax. It is to assist the government in providing money for public use. So those taxes do all kinds of things. It helps to run our government. It helps to provide benefits to the individual people within the government. It also provides benefits to all of us who pay those taxes and helps run our country the way that it ought to. So all those taxes are charges that are levied by the government to help the greater purpose. Now, there are other purposes besides just raising money that we have taxes. One of those is to discourage bad behavior. So there are higher levels of taxes on certain vices, we might say, that could be considered bad for your health. So cigarettes, you pay an additional tax. That tax money then goes to the government. But if you want to buy those, there are higher taxes on that. There's a number of other things as well. That's just one example. We also tax imports because we are trying to encourage our domestic industries. So we'll talk more about this when we get to economics next semester, but when we have two different farmers growing the same product, one of them lives in California and they're growing, well, let's just say they're growing avocados there. And then you have avocados coming from Mexico. Well, we want to support the American avocados, so we are going to tax the Mexican avocados to make them more expensive when they come in, and that way it helps support the American growers a little bit at a higher rate than what it would the Mexican growers. So we're trying to encourage domestic industries by using tax there, and we also require taxes on certain licenses, and that way it encourages people to be serious about the job or the license they are pursuing rather than just handing those out. So there are licensing fees that help pay for the paperwork and everything that goes into that. So those are also part of it. Not necessarily doesn't generate a lot of revenue, but before you can perform those services, you have to pay for that license. About 95% of our federal money comes from taxes. That is how important taxes are, and that's why it's always a major point of conversation when it comes to election time. The Constitution does address this a little bit. There are certain limitations, and there are provisions that have to be made on taxes here. Taxes have to be for the general welfare. They have to be for a public purpose. They can't be just to benefit a small group of people or an individual. And Congress is not allowed to tax exports. We want to encourage Americans to export to other countries. Make stuff here, export it elsewhere. So we don't want to tax that. So they're not even allowed to, even if they wanted to change that. All taxes that are regular taxes need to be uniform across the states. You can't favor a state over another when it comes to national taxes, that type of thing. So there are some certain restrictions on there. Now, Congress also here in the express powers has the ability to borrow. And there's no constitutional limit on that borrowing power. Congress does set their own limits at times through some of the laws that they pass where they will limit themselves and they'll say, we don't want to borrow more than this, but the Constitution does not say you're only allowed to borrow X amount of money. And so that has drawn some controversy, especially when Congress begins to reach that spending limit. Then what do you think they do? Dasher? They raise it up again. And then they reach that spending limit. We didn't quite give ourselves enough. Let's raise the bar again. And we'll just keep increasing our spending. Instead of cutting spending, why won't they cut spending? What? Why is it hard? I agree with you. Why is it hard to cut spending? Everybody likes spending money. Why do you think credit card industry makes so much money? Wait till we talk about credit cards in econ next semester. That's a fun conversation.
You should,
Why else is it hard to cut spending besides just everybody loves spending money? Everything costs money. So
because you need to pay for what if you had we're preparing for war and the military advances.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to make those decisions because are we going to cut military spending? Are we going to cut spending for education? Everywhere somebody's going to suffer because we decide to cut our spending. And to try to tell those kids in elementary school that we decide to cut funding for public school lunches, you don't have a lunch today, it's a really hard conversation to have. So typically they don't like to do that and they don't like to cut spending. So that has led us to deficit spending. By the way, our federal debt in 2006 was $8.5 trillion. 10 years, I guess 11 years ago now. $8.5 trillion. I can't even comprehend $8.5 trillion. Today, well, I should say 2016, $13.2 trillion. We nearly doubled in 10 years our deficit that we had racked up over 200 years. In 10 years' time, we have doubled it. You can go, there is a calculator, if you just Google it, it will show you our current national debt and where our federal debt is at. It is astronomical to look at it. It breaks it down. If you get on the right one, it'll break it down by individual and how much every American owes. This is why I put this comic up on the screen. Because you are inheriting the debt of your parents and grandparents and all of the decisions that have been made that were not your own, but it's there. So we are faced with deficit spending. So deficit spending is where we spend more than what we collect on taxes. So we know when we set the budget, we are not going to collect enough money in taxes to cover all of our spending here. We're just going to add more to the debt. And every year since 1931, we have run a government deficit, except for there was a short period of time, about 11 years, where we did that. You found usdebtclock.org. Yeah. 20 trillion today. Wow.
62,500 per citizen.
$62,000 per citizen. So start saving. Not for college. Pay off the national debt. Wow. So politically, it's much easier just to keep going into debt than it is to tell the people, hey, we don't have any money. we're going to cut all these funds and we're just going to change the way we do things. So thirdly here, the Commerce Power. Our Congress has the power to regulate interstate and foreign trade. So they're the ones that are going to set the laws here regarding this. There are 4 limitations on any laws that they can put in place regarding trade and commerce with other nations. We cannot tax exports. That was something I mentioned just a moment ago. You cannot have favoritism on any port city. I think the reasons here are pretty clear. We don't want to favor Boston over San Francisco. We don't want to favor Miami over New Orleans when it comes to taxation. Now, if the individual companies decide they want to go there, proximity, that is a different story. But when it comes to the laws that Congress puts into place, they can't put anything that would favor one port over another. You can't redirect a ship to pay extra tax. So if a ship is scheduled to go to Savannah, Georgia, you can't require it to go through Boston first, collect a tax on it, and then redirect it and reroute it to its destination, Savannah. Many of our ships pay a tax when they come into the port, so you can't require them to go to multiple ports before they get to their final destination. If they do it on their own choosing, that's up to them. You also have a clause in here that they were not allowed to interfere with slave trade up through 1808. Obviously, that one has been nixed out of this. It is no longer valid due to the 13th Amendment. But that was part of the original Constitution, where Congress is not allowed to make any laws to change the slave trade until 1808. After 1808, this part of it did expire as well. So Congress is also given the power to coin money and to regulate our currency. They also get to determine our value in our money. Was it your group that saw the shredding of money on CNN 10, or was it yesterday? It must have been yesterday. So one of the stories on CNN 10 yesterday was where they interviewed a company and a guy who his job is to shred American currency. And they shred, I think he said $8 million a day in cold, hard cash. They work for the federal bank. All right, the federal bank regulates the money that's in circulation. So these are bills that have been torn, drawn on, just they're worn. They need to be moved out of circulation. Well, you can't just throw them away. You got to shred them. And so they shred I think it was $8 million every day that they sent to the shredder. And it shows all these bills being put into the shredder and coming out as little tiny pieces of paper. It just makes you want to cry. But then they've started, and the whole point of the story was that they've started taking those shreds and they will send them off to this composting company, and they mix it with certain compost and they turn it into some sort of soil that they send to urban centers. I think this one was in New Orleans, if I remember right. And they will grow urban gardens using money soil. And so, what? Yeah, and the guy even mentioned that. He's like, this is $1 million garden right here. But by the time he gets it, you can't even tell it's money because it's broken down and it's compost. But yeah, it is. It's pretty sad when you see all that money being torn up. But Congress here, they have the ability to coin money, to regulate value. That's one of the things in the Constitution. States are prohibited from doing that. They are specifically denied the ability to make their own money. Congress did not issue paper money until the 1860s. Up until that point, it was all coins. And that paper money is what we call legal tender. And if you think about it, when you pull out a $20 bill or $5 bill and you look at it, it says this note is legal tender. The only reason that's worth anything is because our government says it is. If all of a sudden the government said we are no longer backing our paper money, then all of that cash that you have in your wallet is worthless. And that's a really depressing thought. Or if our government were to shut down and close for good, all of that money that you've accumulated is now worthless. This is part of the reason why in many governments, including the Confederacy, When the government collapsed, they took that money and they started burning it because it was more valuable to use as a heat source or as wallpaper than it was to try to go out and find somebody that wanted it. So legal tender is what we call our paper money, and it is backed by Congress. I think that's all I want to say about that right now. We'll come back and we'll talk more about that in Econ next semester. Another express power here for Congress is bankruptcy power. So this is Congress's ability to allow you to go through the legal process of getting rid of your debts. Now, this is not a fun process. You may have known somebody that has gone through this, and it is extremely difficult to do, not only from a legal standpoint, but just from an emotional standpoint. You have to go to the government. You have to declare that I cannot pay any of my debts. I have no money. And while it is a fun thing in Monopoly, in real life, this is not anywhere near that same experience. So in this particular case, they will go through all of your financial records. They will look for any areas that they can sell off items that you may own. If you own a house, they're going to sell it off. You don't get to keep any of the money. If you have a car, they're going to sell it off. If you have a bank account, they're going to take every penny out of that bank account they can in order to pay off your debts. Once they have taken everything that they can to pay off your debts, then they will say, okay, so you still have $10,000 you can't pay. We are going to notify all those creditors. You can't pay your debts. They will forgive your debt, and you essentially get a fresh start and you get to start over. In some cases, you can file for certain chapters of bankruptcy that will protect some of your assets. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump's company has gone through this a couple of times. Not him personally, but his company has, where he has filed for bankruptcy. It has protected some of his personal assets, but his company essentially was done for. So people that go through bankruptcy, it is a 7-year process to get back to where you could ever apply for a loan. You could be able to get yourself financially reset once again. So they kind of keep watch over you for the next 7 years. I've had a couple friends that have gone through this, and it's not very fun to do. We do want to make sure that we have a uniform law for all states when it comes to bankruptcy across the board. This would prevent anybody from going from the state of Indiana over to the state of Ohio, because Ohio's bankruptcy laws are more favorable. We definitely don't want to doing that. A couple other expressed powers that are pretty quick. I'm just going to run through here for you, just have an idea of what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. One of those here has to do with foreign relations. The Congress has the highest power in foreign affairs. So they're going to deal with approving treaties. They're going to deal with the relationship between ambassadors. States are not allowed to participate in any sort of foreign relation engagement, conversations. Those are specifically reserved for Congress. Congress also has war powers. They have here, I think it is 6 powers here that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Obviously, the most important one there is the power to declare war. The president cannot declare war on his own. He must get a declaration of war from Congress. He can go and request it from Congress, but they are the ones that ultimately take us into war. So when it comes to the controversial Vietnam War or the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, where we want to blame certain presidents, they may have asked for that, but Congress was ultimately the one that allowed us to go into war. So the finger needs to kind of be pointed there as well. They have the power to raise and support armies. They have the power to maintain a navy, to regulate the land and sea forces. They can call up state militias and also issue letters of marque. Anybody know what a letter marquee deals with? I didn't know this until I started teaching government. Well, yeah, reprisals are part of it as well, but letters marquee kind of its own thing. Yeah, it allows for piracy. So we can actually grant somebody the ability to conduct piracy. Now, these were forbidden back in the 1850s, kind of as a universal global thing that a whole bunch of nations agreed to. So the United States is one of those. We've agreed not to issue letters of marque any longer, and we have followed that since the 1850s. But in our Constitution, it gives us the right and the ability to essentially give somebody a license to become a pirate. Go ahead and try it. See what happens. Let's also talk about the War Powers Act. Maybe. Appears as though we are frozen up there. There we go. So together, let me talk about the War Powers Act for just a minute. This was 1973, and this was an act that was brought by Congress in order to deal with the Vietnam situation, and it attempted to limit the president's power to use force without congressional approval. So 1973, Vietnam War is happening. What event had just gone on that brought this into question? Maybe we should jump back. Who's president in 1973? Vietnam War.
JFK.
Not after JFK. This is, yeah.
Already in the grave.
So, who? Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had just dealt with what major event in Vietnam? 1968 was no, actually I take that back. 68, Nixon took over. So Johnson was no longer there, but it was a result of Johnson's acts in the 1960s with the Tet Offensive. And so we started to, what? Vietnamization, okay. They viewed that the president was taking too much liberty to escalate the war and then eventually to de-escalate the war, and they wanted him to have to check in with Congress a little bit more. And so the War Powers Act of 1973 sought to limit his powers when it comes to wartime efforts and making sure that he is connecting in with the Congress on all those things. So no president has ever acknowledged this, by the way. They have continued to refuse to follow the War Powers Act, and the Supreme Court has never brought this before them. They've never, even though it's been challenged, they've chosen not to deal with it. A few other things here just to wrap up this section. Congress has the power to regulate naturalization. This is the legal process by which a foreigner can become a citizen. The postal power, regulating all of our mail system, established post office and roads, postal roads. They also have the power of copyrights and patents. So what does copyright do? Who does it protect? Protects artists? Yeah. People who have creative ideas, they can put copyrights on their things to make sure somebody else doesn't steal their idea. Or same thing happens here with patents, dealing with inventions. And that way, whoever is the original creator of those things gets credit for it and gets compensation for it. So you definitely want to make sure that you are going through the Copyright and Patent Office.
So what's a trademark?
Trademark would be similar. It would be under the same thing there, where you have a phrase or logo of some sort that you can copyright. Now, I don't know all the legal terminology as far as giving advice as to whether you'd want to trademark something or copyright it. That goes beyond my understanding. David?
So if you wanted to, if you had something that you created and you wanted to keep the rights and sell it, you would need a copyright and patent, because patent gives you like the rights to keep manufacturing it and the right to the idea, and then the copyright gives you the right to reproduce it.
That sounds about right, yeah. Good explanation. So I've not done a whole lot of digging into that area to know the exact process in which you want to do that. But that does sound like that would work really well. Very good. They also have the power of over weights and measures. It's because of Congress that we have the English system instead of the metric system. Many people around the world have complained about the Americans maintaining the English system and want us to go metric. That's what 90% of the world does. We continue to be stubborn and say we're going to maintain with our inches and feet. Please don't give us meters. Okay, miles too, sure. So Congress is the one. If you want to change that, reach out to your congressman. If you want to keep it the same way, reach out to him anyway. We also have territorial powers. These powers here allows Congress to acquire, manage, and dispose of land. This is part of what got Thomas Jefferson into trouble when he purchased Louisiana Territory. Congress said, you don't have that authority, only we have that authority. And they went back and forth about that. Ultimately, they both agreed that this is a good thing, regardless of who acquired that property. And so they have that power to do so. And then judicial powers, they have the power to create new courts. And structure the judicial system. So in the event that we have a court that is overwhelmed and we need to divide up the district court into multiple courts, they will be the ones to make that decision. They also have the power to define what federal crimes are. Here under their judicial powers, there are 4 listed federal crimes. They're not going to show up on the screen, but you should take note of these 4. The first one is counterfeiting. That is considered a federal crime if you are to go out and print your own money. Don't do it. It's not worth it.
There's a problem like last year with a bunch of counterfeit coins.
Really? In our area? Wow. We get next semester in economics, I'll talk about counterfeiting. I've got a few counterfeit bills that I'll show you. One of which is a 50 that a friend of mine acquired and then gave it to me to use as an illustration for economics. So I'll tell you that story when we get to economics next semester. Counterfeiting is one of those crimes committed on the high seas or international waters. So any of those crimes that are committed out in the ocean, those would be considered to be federal crimes. Thirdly, any offense against international law, which I doubt any of you are going to be a part of, but just keep that in the back of your mind. It's considered a federal crime. It'll be punished to the full extent of the law under Congress's authority. So offenses against international law, and then 4th is treason. So those are the 4 that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Since the Constitution was originally written, Congress has added about 100 more federal crimes to that list of 4. I'm not going to go through all of those, but there are many other crimes that were added later on. Now let's talk through some implied powers. All the ones up to this point, they have been mentioned specifically in the Constitution. These are ones that aren't necessarily there, but we take some liberty. We're going to go loose interpretation here for a moment. So this all comes out of the necessary and proper clause, sometimes also labeled the elastic clause. This comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. And it says here that Congress will have the power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper to execute any of the enumerated powers. So in this particular section, what the Constitution is telling Congress is you have the ability to add new laws, to enforce them the way that you believe they need to be enforced in order to execute the ones that we've already listed. It's very broad. Part of the reason why it's called the elastic clause is because that it has been stretched very long in some cases in our nation's history. So some people believe that this means whatever's convenient or whatever's useful. And they will take that interpretation, and so it really gives them a broad spectrum to work with. It all came to head here with early on in our nation's history with Alexander Hamilton and the National Bank, as there was a battle here over strict versus loose interpretation in this particular clause. Of course, the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton, they wanted to stretch the clause. They wanted to define necessary and proper when it came to the bank, as this is going to benefit all of society, and the Anti-Federalists said, no way. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Federalists and supported the elastic clause. So this is one of those court cases that I do believe that it would be important for you to understand and to know that it supports the elastic clause. It supports a loose interpretation of the Constitution when it comes to this particular necessary and proper phrase. And ever since then, that's where our Constitution has been interpreted, or at least with this particular section has been interpreted. Any questions there?
What was that
Josh?
court case by?
The court case was determining whether or not a loose interpretation of the elastic clause was acceptable, and they determined yes, it was. And so the necessary and proper clause was supported with a loose interpretation by that case. So that's given Congress many more freedoms to be able to write laws that are not specifically granted in the Constitution because of that.